Hello, everyone, and welcome to another new episode of Emotional Eating Unwrapped. I'm your host, Alana Kessler, and today is going to be a little bit different than usual because I have a really special episode and a really special guest. Today, I'm going to be chatting with my behind the scenes magician who helps edit the podcast, helps create the podcast with me, Kassi. Welcome. Welcome to the
Hi, everybody.
podcast. Welcome to the front facing side of the podcast.
Yes, good to be on the other side.
And we are having this episode today. It was kind of one of these things that we just decided to do on a whim because Kassi and I were chatting during one of our weekly meetings, and we were talking about just the process of how the podcast came to be and how I came to found Be Well by AK and some of my story. And she was asking me all these questions, and I realized that I have never actually officially shared my story on the podcast or really in long form ever. Uh, really ever to anybody except little snippets on social media, little snippets on Instagram, little snippets in the newsletter and things like that. But I've never really gone deep into some of the layers of the real journey and the real transformation and just the humanity of it all. Healing from emotional binge eating, healing from uh, a lot of self-hate, a lot of energetic misalignment, not even knowing I had energetic misalignments, not even knowing how I was going to get through to the other side, and all the faith it took for me to do that and action that it took for me to do that. So Kassi had all these great questions, and we were like, let's just make this an episode. And so here is that episode. So I have no idea what Kassi is actually going to ask me.
No pressure, no pressure.
So this is going to be new, but I am going to be the guest today, and Kassi, you could just take over. So
Yeah, we're quite literally flipping the script on you today. But like I said, no pressure. But I mean, I feel like when we were having these conversations, my initial kind of thing is like wanting to know the history behind it all, and you said it so beautifully. But I guess starting I it sounds a little loaded, but starting from the beginning of when you started realizing that you, or maybe not even when you started realizing, but when you started kind of exhibiting these behaviors that of emotional eating or just certain triggers in your life or what have you. Care to speak on that at all to
when
start?
I started noticing,
Yeah.
yeah. So I would actually say that it started for me when I was a teenager, when I was about 15, 16, was when I really started to, you do behaviors that were not, that were not healthy with food, and, do behaviors with my body that were not healthy. So, I have a history of binging, but I also have a history of binging and purging. So for me, that was something that was very uh, that was very big for me, and started when I was a teen, and it made me feel in control. I would say that I've always been an anxious person. I started biting my nails. I was like 5 years old. I've always been, kind of a sensitive. I take things personally. I'm kind of sensitive. Yeah. So I think now looking back, I could name it, but then I think I really just used food and used the behaviors of compulsive eating and having that release with the purging as kind of this place for me to process a lot of my emotions. Um, and yeah, like for a while, it felt really powerful. And I think that that's something that's really important to acknowledge that sometimes in the beginning of behaviors like this, it can feel really powerful. And then obviously over time, it became something that was inhibiting me to move forward. It became something that wasn't empowering at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, I mean, like you said, there comes a point where you're like, this isn't empowering anymore. Was there ever like a moment for you, or was it like a gradual realization where you're like, this is inhibiting the life that I want to live or the life that I should be living or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it took a while. I would say that um, having that safety net, like I call it almost like a best friend that I had, almost like this secret that was mine, and then I could plug into to feel in control. And for me, that was what it was for me. For other people, for other people, it's maybe just binging. For other people, it's overeating. Whatever it is, everyone, people who can resonate with this will have their own version of it. But for me, it was it didn't take away from my life until I probably noticed that it wasn't great um, in my early 20s. But I would say that the body stuff that was a result of this behavior with food was something that started to become really draining on my self esteem and self worth since I'm probably like 18 years old. Right. Because in the beginning, it's kind of like, oh, I lost a little weight and like, I was skinny and the whole thing. Obviously, I was not healthy and I was obsessed with my coping behaviors and my control behaviors. But I looked good and I looked like good in the sense of the society was validating my physical appearance, and I wasn't connecting how like awful I was feeling doing the behaviors to it not being good for me because I was young, and I wasn't, and I was just happy I was being validated. It was only when the physical results started to go away, which happens, with binge eating, which happens when you do any kind of aggressive situation to get your body to a certain weight. And I wasn't able to reclaim that body weight. It started to become an obsession for me to like get back to that body weight. And I also felt really out of control with my eating because now the binging and the whole thing had become an addiction. So I was addicted to that dopamine situation from the binging and the purging. And so, an addict, so to speak, to this behavior, my body wasn't where I wanted it to be either. And it was causing me a lot of stress and anxiety and shame. And slowly I started to build more and more walls up in my life. I started to become much more just hyper independent. I started to go inside myself a lot, which is part of my personality. I am an introvert, in some senses, but it started to be it was a protection. So there's a big difference between understanding when you're going inwards to resource yourself and when you're going inwards to protect yourself. And I would say that when I realized that it wasn't that the way that I was behaving in my life with food and with the way that I was thinking about my body and the way that I was just my self-criticism, my healing journey began when I started to fluctuate between the self-protection and the resourcing, right? So that it was self-protection, but eventually once I realized that, I used the opportunity of being really insular with myself to start to invest my energy into like yoga and mindfulness retreats and like solitary activities, but that would resource healing for myself.
For
And
sure.
that was the beginning of the journey for me. And I was, 19 years old. I put myself into therapy. I invest, I'd spend this is a huge joke that a lot of my friends know, and even my old colleagues. And I don't know if I'm going to give a shout out to my friend and old colleague, Debbie, who was my soul sister in this situation. But as you know, I'm a registered dietitian. And in my first few years in my career, I worked clinically at a hospital in New York City. And that means that you just work like a 9 to 5. But at my hospital, you just had to work 8 hours. So it could be like 9 to 5, 8 to 4, 7 to 3. You can decide. And so what I would do, and this was a little bit later. So at this point, I was 25, 24, maybe 24 or so. And yeah, so this is like 20 years ago. Oh no, yeah, like 19 years ago, basically. And so let me just backtrack for a second. So 19 was when I started to aggressively pursue like therapy and yoga. I was in college and all that. But when I started to make it a like huge priority, this is a good example. So I was working at the hospital clinically, and what I would do is I prioritized yoga and meditation so much that there was this class at 10:45 a.m. in Lincoln Center that if you're from New York, it's kind of like in the 60s, and my hospital was on 110th Street. So I had to take a subway down to the 60s to get to this class at 10:45 a.m., which is kind of like early, obviously for lunch, but I would go because that was my commitment to myself. I became really, really committed to this yoga as like a healing, getting me reconnected to my body, which was huge for me to get reconnected to my body after years of severing myself from my body, using abusing my body in all of these ways. And so reconnecting to my body was such a massive thing for me. And so I was very, very committed to going to this class that I loved, this teacher. And what I would do is I would have my colleagues basically lie for me, or basically tell the manager. If the manager was looking for me, I would tell them to tell her that I went to an early lunch.
Mm-hmm.
And then hopefully, by the time she was looking for me again, I'd be back. And it took me like 2.5 hours or so, the whole thing, soup to
This
nuts, right?
long early lunch.
Right. So like I would leave at 10:20, I would get there at 10:45. It was like an hour and 15-minute class. I'd be back by like 12:30, right? And then it occurred to me that this kind of whole ordeal and sort of lying about it or worrying about getting caught was counterproductive to what I was trying to do. So I said, you know what? Let me just tell her the truth, right? Like, let
Mhm.
me just go in and be like, I really want to take this class. I'm happy to stay an hour later. I'm happy to come an hour earlier. Just like, I really want to take this class. And so I did. And she told me no. And I quit on the spot.
There you go. That's a boundary right there, though.
And I quit on the spot. And that's how I started my journey with
Mhm.
like what I do now, because of that commitment. And that's why and really it's like committing to it and just continuing to commit to it. And that's why I'm so aggressive about kind of jumping into the commitment when it feels right before you know if it's going to work out for you, if you know that it's right for you. And because usually it does in that sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, and I love the framework that you have where it's like there's no such thing as half healing. You really have to go all into it once you really commit to that being this part in your journey. I think that it is really admirable for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and I also at the time, like I said, during when this happened, I was around 24, and I said that I started my behaviors with emotional eating and binge eating and everything when I was 16. So this is 8 years later. And so in the 8 years in between this, there were about 4 years that I probably was, you know, just sleepwalking and didn't really have any awareness of how bad it was. Then there was like when I was 19 where I kind of realized that it was inhibiting my life and I got very self-protected. But I really invested a lot of time and energy into all of these healing modalities, but I still was a dietitian working in nutrition at a hospital. It was only in that story that I just told you where it all came together for me, where I was like, this isn't aligned for me to do this anymore. Like, I can't be a nutritionist and still be struggling so much with this behaviors. I just can't. Like, it's too compartmentalized. And that's also when I realized that being compartmentalized to a certain extent, until you integrate yourself in some ways, you're not going to heal, you know? And so for me, it was just way too disintegrated, right? Being a nutritionist and all of these things, and knowing that in my secret life, I was struggling so badly with this because at 24 and 25, I was still really struggling. I would say that those were my rock bottom years. Like 25 was like rock bottom for me. Like there were days where I was like, I don't even know if I'm going to make it like out of this apartment.
Yeah.
Truth. You know, and for the people that have never heard me talk about this before, they might be like, whoa, I never knew this. But there were days where I would spend 3 days just like in my apartment. And the only thing that I would do is go out to the grocery store again and spend like, money, tons of money, and like watch TV and rinse and repeat the whole thing. And go to yoga. By the way, I never stopped going to yoga. So like I would go to yoga dehydrated after a binge, after a whole thing. Like I never stopped going. And to this day, it's 25 years. There's still not a day that goes by that I don't do some form of yoga and meditation. And it is a huge part, not like formal classes in my framework, but the mindsets and like the teachings. It's so integrated and in my cells at this point that it is part of the reason why my framework works so well with people. And continuing to stay committed to that practice, and not as an exercise, not as like a trendy thing, not as a workout class, but as almost like, but as a North Star, as a value system, like as, I'm not going to say a religion because it's not religious, but, as something that you just commit to as far as what guides your ethics, what
Yeah.
guides your self-value, your self-worth, like what you can plug into. And over the years, I added on so many other things. Like, I've studied Buddhism, I studied different types of yoga. I'm certified in Ayurveda. I became a functional dietitian. Eventually, I ended up obviously doing nutrition again. It wasn't until I was 32, though. So when I quit my job as the clinical dietitian, a couple months later, I opened up a private practice with an old colleague from the hospital, actually, because she was inspired by what I did.
I
um,
love
and
that.
we opened up our private practice together, but I still wasn't ready to do nutrition. So the private practice was very holistic in the sense that it would incorporate yoga and meditation. I wanted to invest more of my energy and time into the yoga and meditation part, not so much the nutrition part. And so it wasn't a good fit for us to work together as partners in this, in this enterprise together, because we had different visions for how we wanted to help people. I wanted to help people more through, like, for me, getting into your body and reconnecting to your body and your values and your self-worth. And the food part will come, secondary to you wanting to treat yourself well with food because you're reconnected to your body. And so that will be your motivation for making good food choices slash not being mad at yourself for making quote unquote bad food choices, because there won't be good or bad food. You'll just be more in tune with what you want and need, and both are okay and good. And that's where I wanted to come from. I didn't want to come from like the more Western side, and she did. So even though she respected the Eastern, she wanted the point of entry to be like, the doctor referrals and all that stuff. This person has cardiovascular disease, this person has diabetes, and let's give them a holistic slant to their meal plan. And I was like, yeah, okay, but I kind of want to teach people just how to love themselves and breathe and get into their bodies, and then be like, how can I eat better for my body that I now love, So, or that I'm starting to reconnect to. So it was two different avenues. And so I opened so we went our own ways, and I opened up my yoga studio, Sangha Yoga Shala, when I was 27, 28. Potentially I became a yoga teacher in 2007, 2007. And that was around the year that I started this private practice. And then we went our own ways a couple months later. And then I immediately opened up my yoga studio, like 2008. And essentially I just taught yoga and I taught meditation, and I, led the community, and it was amazing. And I still struggled with my emotional and binge eating, even to this day. Like, even not to this day, even to this day in that time, So like 2008, when I opened the studio, 2009, I was still struggling. It wasn't until 2011, I would say, I was 30 years old, that I something changed. I would say in those years before that, 2008, 2009, 2010, maybe towards the end of 2010, I was still like following diets. I was still, relapsing sometimes into the behaviors, and I was still self-protected and not feeling like I was able to cultivate the type of relationships that I wanted. And I was still insecure about my body, and it was holding me back from, intimacy and feeling like I was attractive enough to really allow myself to get close to somebody. And I would say that it was 2011 when it just all came together. I know it sounds weird, but like everything that I had done for the last 15 years, all of the commitment to the yoga, all the commitment to the meditation, all the different, all the different trainings and courses and retreats and everything that I had done over the last 15 years, it kind of just came together into a new vibration of being. And I was able to understand, it was almost like a download. I just understood how it all came together, and I started to be able to share that with people. Like people would
That
ask,
Saturn returned, and you were like, got it.
right, maybe like people were able to share, people were asking me, and I realized that I was giving people advice. I was giving people counsel around nutrition and loving yourself and body and weight loss and natural weight loss, and just kind of my way. And so people ask me all the time, like, was there a course you took to teach the way you do? And I'm like, no, like I created the course because nobody had it that way. It just kind of coalesced for me. And then people started asking questions, and then I started giving answers. And that's when I was like, oh, I guess maybe I should do nutrition again. And now nutrition for me is defined differently. It's not just food. It's not calories in, calories out. It's not macros, energy. Nutrition to me is everything that you metabolize. It is your food, but it's your relationships, it's your environment, And it's how do you align yourself so that you can create the conditions for your metabolism to be optimal. And that's not just your stomach or or like the way you process food to burn fat. Like that's to me not what metabolism means. You could to me your metabolism is influenced by way more things than just that, right? So I would say that it was the years are just flying. I would say that it was like 12 years ago that I started to, or maybe 13 years ago that I started to counsel nutrition again. And then I don't know, it's just kind of, like I said, it's just mad. It just stopped. Like it stopped. Like I stopped binging. I stopped overeating. I stopped doing all the addictive behaviors. It just kind of stopped. Now, not to say that I don't feel anxious still, or I don't sometimes feel that like bigness in my body of like the urgency stuff, but I I know what to do. I know how to process that. Um, there's no way that I would ever go back to the old way. Um, and now, for me, it's been a really long time. It's been a really long time.
Yeah. And I think what's so interesting just hearing you speak is the idea that this affected so much of your life for so long. It was a part of your whole life.
Hmm.
And so letting that healing affect every part of your life and really integrating that into your life, um, and letting it become something that made you or allowed you to set boundaries or, that sort of thing is really key and I think is present in your framework um, of the idea of even the things that we don't want to talk about, the shame, or maybe the things that
Hmm.
aren't so glamorous or so linear in
Hmm.
healing. I think they you kind of make space for and I love to hear more about kind of that inclusion of the ugly parts of it all, because I really think that's apparent in your framework for sure.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. And I think something that's really interesting to say is that on the outside, nobody would have thought that I was struggling with this because I, I took on such a strong doing persona, right? Like I owned a studio, I led a community. From the outside it looked so much like I had it together and also I was achieving. And I always talk about this that achieving is one side of the coin, but receiving is the other side of the coin. And I didn't know how to receive. So, in all the years, and that was the biggest wound that I had from my childhood, from my teenage years, that was probably the biggest wound that I never really grew. Like I grew so many other skills. And this is like what I talk about with the women that work with me. It's like there's the side that of you that's the doer, and then there's a side of you that's the receiver. And for some of us who are struggling with emotional eating, or a lot of times we hide behind the doer persona, and we're really good at that. And we get a lot of accolades at that. And the truth is, you could stay that way. And it takes a very courageous person to say, I'm not happy, even with the validation of that work situation. I closed my yoga studio in 2017, not because it wasn't flourishing from a community perspective, is because I realized that the energy that I was putting into being this doer and not having the other side being nurtured, like having a loving, like feeling loved, like having a loving support system that was not related to work, right? Like it was so great that I had my teachers and like my staff, and we were like quote unquote family, but like at the end of the day, it's not great boundaries when like your work people are like that's it for your support system. It's really not. And we are in a culture now where boundaries are extremely difficult, and there's a lot of overlap between work and life, and like um, oversharing, and like a lot. It's really hard to have that. And I would say that it was a really, I closed the studio because I needed to learn how to be a receiver. Not to say that I'm still not a doer, and I am, of course, but I realized that it was going to take me more energy to to grow that part of myself, to mature that part of myself. I was mature in so many other ways, and the layperson would think I was mature, hard stop, 100%. you know and honestly, it would even like be fine, because we live in a society where women independence and feminism and like all this stuff's like, who cares? And I could have gotten behind that and taken on that costume, but inside I was like, I am not like happy. And I was being shown that by the relationships that I was attracting in my life. I was attracting very unsupportive partners. I was attracting, men. I like men. So for me, it was men. I was attracting men who were very much, um, not taking care of my emotions, not, caring about my feelings. I felt like I had to overfunction. I felt there wasn't that safety that I felt. And ultimately I realized that I was attracting what I was attracting that because I hadn't built that in myself. And I didn't know how to receive. So why would I attract a man who would be looking for a woman who could receive? I wouldn't,
Mm-hmm.
because I didn't know how. So I was like, whoa, I have to learn how to receive. And that's actually a practice. Like that's actually, and how to collab, and how to just like grow that part of myself. Some would call it feminine energy, right? And that is a huge part of my framework now with women who, are very much in their type A masculine 100% of their life. For me now, it's a balance, right? Like I grew that part of myself. I stepped down from the hypermasculine in order to take some time to focus more on that feminine energy piece. And I did. And eventually I found a good balance where now I do both for myself. And, I attracted a partner. And, it took me until I was 39 years old. Like I didn't get married till I was 40. That is perfect. It's everything I wanted. Um, Perfect for me. And it's not a perfect relationship all the time, but it is perfect even in the imperfection, because of my skills. And I attracted a very highly emotionally intelligent man as well, who has all of what I wasn't getting before because I gave it to myself first.
Mm-hmm.
And
I
yeah.
have you ever heard, it's like a quote poem, but it's essentially like, to my mother, I say that love is gross. To my friends, I say that love is not necessary, or affection is not necessary, but secretly I crave it. And it goes on. It's a very beautiful kind of poem. But to me, that kind of means that you want it, but you're denying, or you've convinced yourself that you don't need it. And calling back to kind of what you were saying earlier of like, kind of, if you build this concrete, the weeds are going to find a way to grow like around it.
Yep.
But if you convince yourself you don't need something, you're essentially just kind of denying yourself. Love is a basic human need. Affection is a basic human need. And so by kind of convincing yourself that you don't need it, you're kind of denying yourself that truth. And I think that's so kind of honest. And I had kind of a point where I was going with this, but it's
Yeah.
so so honest, because you're kind of, what was I even saying? Girl,
No, no, no. But
what's
I'm
going
gonna
on?
say, I'm gonna jump in and say
Yeah.
that I think that I think that a major reason why women don't get to the results that they're looking for or heal is because of a denial of a certain truth that they want. And a lot of times, just admitting your own truth, like me acknowledging my own truth, was so freeing. But also, what I had to do was acknowledge that even though I'm like, you know, a master's level in my work life, I was a first grader in this part of it. And
Mm-hmm.
that is a very humbling thing to have to say.
Mm-hmm.
And the only reason that I got, that I have gotten to this place in my life that feels so fulfilling and so great, um, is because I was willing to learn, to admit what I didn't know without it making me wrong. I somehow had that all my life. Like even when I was hating myself and, abusing myself in these ways, I still was able to be a student, like be a beginner. And I think that's probably one of my best qualities is that I'm always a beginner with things. And if that's one of the things that I impart to all my clients or any woman that's listening to this, just be willing to be a beginner. Obviously put your trust in something and don't overinvest too soon. And that comes with anything, right? That comes with wherever you put your energy, that comes with dating, that comes with relationships, that comes with, you know, anything that you invest in, whether it's money or energy. But, you know, being able to say, I'm a first grader when it comes to learning how to build my life from a relational perspective and build out the fullness of my life, and that work and being successful at work or making a lot of money at work or getting accolades at work is really not enough for me. And I'm willing to admit that to myself, even if it means that I don't know what making it enough for me even looks like yet. I kind of know, but I'm willing to be very open minded and curious and take the actions to figure it out. And, I think what I love about what I do now is I've walked that path and I've successfully walked that path and I've tried so many different things. And I would say that for women that are similar to me, who are looking to build out that part of their lives, I've walked the path and I have that solution. Like I know step by step exactly what you really need to focus on. And you'll go from a first grader to a master student really quickly because you're not a child. So ultimately you will learn fast if you have the right actions and you have the right support and you do it. But a lot of it is very different than what people think it is. A lot
Yeah.
of it has to do with the inner stuff. And the interpersonal stuff. And, it is about, of course, I had to learn some I had to learn some new habits with food, but like I said, it's kind of a supporting character at this point in all of it. It's even a supporting character when I notice myself anxious and I find myself like moseying onto the kitchen and, getting snacky. I don't even make it about food. It's not like I'm like, oh my God, I'm eating the, Siete corn chips again. Like, I need to get these out of the house. Like, I don't even
Mm-hmm.
say that. Like, I immediately, it's not even about the food. I'm like, oh my God, I'm anxious. Like, where's the misalignment here? Like, what do I need to look at? What can I focus on to, what can I do with what can I focus on with my attention? Where is the root of the ick basically? And it's never about the food. So
Mm-hmm.
that's that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's so nice to hear too that um, you're doing this work and you're guiding people through like their journeys. And it's not so much that the work is never done, because that feels kind of like, oh God, we're still doing this, but also like, to be frank, the work is never done. Like in the sense that like this this is like a part of, it was a part of your life, it is an integral part of your active life, but also kind of like it stays with you. These kind of be like lessons that you learn, or these lessons that you unlearn, stay with you. And what I think is interesting too is finding somebody who acknowledges that and is like kind of alongside you in that. And because I think a lot of people who may be doing work in the space are kind of like, I'm healed, like I'm I'm apex, and this is what you need to do to get here. But the reality is we're all just kind of like walking walking side by side, and kind of like still using these things that you've learned along your journey to create a life beyond that. You know what I mean? There's still more to it, meaning.
100%. And it's always a journey. That's what I'm saying. It's not about getting somewhere and that being the ultimate goal. I mean, ultimately, yes, have I gotten to a place with my body and like my self-worth and my self-acceptance and self-value that I feel is pretty rock solid? Yes. Does it get shaken up? Yes. But the measure of my success is that it gets back to rock solid really quickly. I don't spiral into like negative things like anymore. Does not happen for me. Do I get mad? Sure. Do I get like insecure? Sure. Do I get negative emotions? Of course. But does it throw me off? No. Like it doesn't. And I always say this, this is something I always say, like balance isn't a place to get to, it's a place to return to. When you have
Mm-hmm.
balance, it's not a place like I'm trying to get to balance. Let me like, aggressive, like contract and try to stay in balance. Like balance, that's not balance. Balance is the skill of knowing how to come back.
I
And
love
so
that.
when you're healed, it's not that you're healed. It's like, it's not that like you're healed, like you said, and it's, you have a gold medal and like, that's that. It's the measure to which you can use your healing to bring you back to yourself because you know yourself. And it becomes healing is like a verb.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, you're essentially broadening your toolbox for when these, because nothing, once you heal,
Yeah.
it's not that nothing bad is ever going to happen to you ever again.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, okay, we've seen this before. We know what
Hmm.
this is, and now what to do. And I think
Hmm.
that's so awesome, is, having somebody on your team, or kind of learning these lessons or kind of tools, to do that without the judgment of being like, okay, well, I'm not healed yet, I'm not perfect yet, which is, I guess the antithesis for a lot of people, people from the very beginning of this process, of like the idea of needing perfection and the idea of needing, um, the picturesque life.
Yeah. And I mean, if there's one thing I could say that is so important, I've said it already, but just to reiterate, is just being honest with yourself. I mean, you can't heal if you're not honest. You're not going to get honesty from a program, right? Like you can't, you're not going to, nothing outside of you is going to uncover what you really feel inside. And so you have to be honest about what you really want, whether that's, whatever that is for you, whether that's, for me, it was wanting to have like a supportive, loving relationship. That was really important to me. I knew that I needed that for my life. And I also wanted to be at a body weight that felt good for me, like that felt that I wanted to be at. I wanted to be at a smaller weight. Like that was that. And I had to acknowledge that honestly to myself. And it was freeing. And I also had to acknowledge to myself that I knew that I had that attitude before and I did wrong things to get there, whether that was the binging and purging, or whether that was following a crazy diet plan or taking diet pills or whatever it was. But the wanting to lose weight wasn't the issue. It was the methods that I was trying to, the methods that I was reaching out to and using to get there. But when I think to myself why I kept doing that, it was because I still really hadn't admitted to myself that like weight loss was such a huge thing for me, because it would unlock for me so much confidence and so much self expression. And I didn't know how to do it without going back to these kind of bad methods. And it was scary for me to want to lose weight, admit that to myself, and also not have an idea of how that would really work without following something that had made me feel so bad before. And I'll say, well, like I said before, the honesty of admitting that to myself, and then kind of just continuing along with my commitments to the healing journey that I was on, then like the healing modalities that I was committed to, and not trying so hard, I lost the weight.
Mm-hmm.
Like I lost the weight. It was because the not trying so hard relaxed my nervous system, and I didn't, have all these I didn't have all of this, I wasn't as triggered, and the weight just came off. And that's what I always like to say, and it came off out of, out as a result of me just saying, okay, I want to lose weight, but I don't know what to do it. And so let me just live in that question for a little while
Mm-hmm.
and continue on with what I'm doing in other areas and see what happens. And like, it came off, you know?
Mm-hmm.
The same thing kind of happened with the relationship stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It was a similar thing. It was like, okay, I know that I need to learn how to receive, and how to stop, be less defensive and be more open, and learn how to collaborate more. And I have to learn how to, if I want to feel taken care of, I have to learn how to allow someone to take care of me. And I realized that these were actual skills I had to learn, and I learned them actually
Mm-hmm.
separately from, like, some other things. Like, those are actual behaviors that I had to change. And those behaviors also eliminated triggers. And I started seeing results and validation through my life, and obviously through my relationships. And it all just came together in such a great, great way. And like I said, I don't always feel amazing 24/7, but I very much know how to get myself back there in a very quick time frame.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I love what you were saying about kind of the idea of being a forever student, or just letting yourself be taken care of, but also letting yourself learn these things, because a lot of times I'm sure there's a lot of mental roadblock that where you're like, yes, I know better, but I'm not going to do better, or I know better, or I'm not going to learn from this. Like, I recognize what's trying to be taught here, but I'm not going to let that affect me, or let that change kind of like my mindset or what have you. And I think there's parallels to me in what you're saying about the idea of letting yourself be taken care of, but also letting yourself take care of you.
Exactly. Well, being taken care of is knowing how to take care of myself,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
and in a way that's not counterproductive to some of my other desires. And I think that that's a really important distinction to
Yeah.
know. And that's the difference between protection and resourcing that we talked about in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why when I work with people, we do interpersonal stuff and we do interpersonal stuff, because the interpersonal is very different than the interpersonal. They're very different skills. And so taking it into I call the interpersonal stuff taking it into the wild, you know? It's like
It's
the
your
Buddha.
safari mission.
No, it's like the Buddha on the mountain is like very, very wise, of
Yeah.
course, but he's on a mountain. I want him
Mhm.
to go into the wild and take this and get triggered by the world and then see how it, you know, it alchemizes and you respond. Like it's a very different thing when you know it all in this book and you read it all and it's all concepts. It's very different when it's application
Yeah.
and it, you know, and it assimilates and you know, and it transmutates and transforms very differently in your body when it's interpersonal and you're kind of just like digesting information, and when you make it interpersonal and it goes deep and it's transformational and you don't lose the interpersonal stuff, but a lot of times when people stay in that information, like collecting information, so it's like I'm going to save 100 posts on Instagram and I'm going to read the carousels, like, and I'm going to feel seen and it's going to be the whole thing. Like, great, like now you understand more. That's good, totally good. I mean, that was me for the 8 years I was telling you about, like 19 to 18 to 25. I was information city. My bookshelves are filled with like, I mean, my husband still laughs at me now. He goes, "Do we need this book still?" I'm like, "Yes, we
Yes,
do."
we do. Okay.
Yeah. But you know, very different than when I finally was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna practice being some of these concepts and embodying some of these concepts and getting feedback from the world. Right?
Mhm.
It's the same thing with like feminine embodiment, right? It's like great, but feminine embodiment in practice is like really different than feminine embodiment
Mhm.
in concepts. And, you know, that's a whole nother conversation. But it's a big one because I think, especially for the women that listen to this podcast or are in my world, I think feminine embodiment is a huge thing for them. And it is really important. But again, like I said, it is about getting into the wild and getting out of the knowing. Like, I know this. Because knowing, again, brain knowing, thinking, it's all masculine energy. Whereas like being, feeling, you know, testing out, curiosity, experimentation, being willing to get feedback, receiving feedback, that is feminine energy, receiving feedback and, you know, disseminating it, discernment's feminine. So actually making a decision, if you're not embodied in your feminine energy, you cannot make a decision.
Mhm.
So a lot of the women I work with actually have very wounded feminine energy. And one of the biggest things that you could do, one of the biggest ways you could know if your feminine energy is out of whack is if you have difficulty making a decision and if you are hyper defensive, hyper protective.
Mhm.
But those are two sides, because sometimes you could be hyper protective, hyper defensive, and you could really be really good at making a decision, or you could be really bad at making decisions and you're not really that hyper protective, hyper defensive.
Mhm.
So a lot of that stuff is what I work on with women, because once you align those energies, really, really amazing for healing.
Yeah.
A lot of the triggers go away. A lot of the a lot of what you really want and desire open up to you,
Mhm.
and almost like magical.
Yeah. So would you say if there's somebody who's kind of like feeling that movement towards wanting to take this step towards healing their, healing their emotional eating or their behaviors with their body, would you say that the beginning work starts with that inner look, or is that kind of more advanced? What would you say is kind of like the first step that you would recommend somebody take with this?
So in my framework, I really like the inner work.
Mhm.
I just think it's a really good foundation. I think it's something that you're not going to get right away. Like some of it might wash over you. And I always think about what actually the yoga teacher that I used to cut work to go to back in the early 2000s,
Mhm.
what she used to say in her classes, what she'd be like, don't try to do everything perfectly. Just let the class watch over you. And whatever happens and sticks, don't try too hard to grasp onto it all. Just let it all wash over you. Pay attention, but whatever sticks is meant to stick now, and you can always come back to class later and, refine and deepen. And so I feel like for me, I love starting with this inner work first because it gives you that foundation, but it's not something that you're going to get the first time around. And so, and so that's why um, I really do like starting with that, because you are always going to have to go back, but it gives you that peace of mind, and it gives you that initial foundation of that self-worth, that self-acceptance, and that self-love piece. And it also gives you some applicable ways to apply it in your life from an interpersonal and an interpersonal level. So in my framework, my program, Decoding Permanent Weight Loss, is that for my programs. And it is something that I always expect and hope that, my clients and students go back to over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. No, I think that's a great like reference too. Like having those resources to be able to kind of like cross reference so you're kind of like, okay, yes, I'm I'm on the right track. Or I think finding that first step is often the hardest part for some. So
Well,
I think that
because I feel like if you don't have that foundation of the inner work and how to align your energy, how to feel self-worth and self-acceptance and self-love, any behavior change, any behavior change tools are going to be difficult to sustain long term once the newness of it goes away, because you're not connected to anything other than the result. But when you're connected to yourself and your self-worth and your self-acceptance and self-love, and you have those alignment anchors in your life that you really get, and you know how to pull on those levers for yourself, you'll be motivated with some of the more strategic things like an eating strategy, or like a rewiring your trigger, like some of the other stuff that I have in the emotional eating solution, which is an amazing course. And I have a lot of a lot of those tools. And I do think that having the inner work more, having the inner work as like a foundational, separate kind of learning
mhm.
is really key.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I feel like we could talk for literally
Yeah,
ever.
yeah.
There's
This is
just
like
stuff
the longest episode I've ever recorded. So I feel like, I hope people are still listening.
for good reason though. Like I feel like it's just so illuminating hearing, your story and just the ideology behind all of it, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, thank
Yeah.
you so
Well,
much.
thank you so much for letting me interview you today.
Well, thank you so
Being
much
in the
for all the
hot seat.
questions. I know. Well, thank you so much for all the questions. Thank you for, yeah, thank you for the space. And I really hope everybody who's listening enjoyed this episode. If you have any other questions for me, you can feel free to put them in the Q&A box on Spotify, or you can always email hello@bewellbyak.com. You could send a DM on Instagram, because we love hearing your questions and we love hearing from you. So thank you so much for joining me today. And don't forget to join me again next week with another new episode about emotional eating, so you can fall in love with eating, start losing weight, and keep it off with sustainable strategies and lasting change. If you found this episode helpful and insightful, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with those who may benefit from this empowering knowledge. I also have free resources on my website to support you on your journey to loving food and losing weight. Just go to www.bewellbyak.com. And until next time, I'm Alana, and thank you for listening to Emotional Eating Unwrapped.